Okay, I'm going to be reading Red Kayak by Priscilla Cummings, Chapter 5. Now, in Chapter 4, they had already found Mrs. D'Angelo somewhere downriver, and Ben was out still looking for. Brady was out still looking for Ben and his. Out because he was out on the water and it was very dangerous. Last thing we heard in Chapter 4 was that he saw a bright spot of yellow. So let's see what happens. Chapter 5. It was Ben. But as I drew closer, I could see that he was motionless, his small body hunched forward, the back of his life jacket caught on a jagged piece of old piling that jutted out of the water like a rotten tooth. Ben, are you okay? I hollered, pulling the boat up alongside. His eyes weren't right. Move, I ordered Tilly, and right away she jumped back into the narrow space in the bow. I flipped the engine into neutral and reached over to pull in Ben. He was a lot heavier than I would have thought, probably because he was so waterlogged. The water was cold, too. I grabbed hold of the collar on his life jacket and summoned all of my strength to unhook him from that piece of wood. For a second, I lost my balance and I nearly went in headfirst myself. But I fell backward instead, never letting go, and I managed to pull Ben into my boat on top of me. It was a rough landing, and I hit my elbow hard on the gunnel. I just hope I didn't hurt Ben. The first thing I did was get his wet life jacket off, that and his soaked parka. And then I took off my own coat, wrapped it around him, and I put my baseball cap up on his head. I rubbed his hands, I patted his cheeks, but he looked terrible lying there on the damp wooden floor of my boat. His face pale as a sheet, his eyes half shut, and his lips as blue as a fresh bruise. I was scared to death because I didn't know what to do. I pulled the cell phone out of my pocket, but my hand was shaking so bad that the phone slipped right out of my grasp, hit the edge of the boat, and disappeared into the water. Oh no, I exclaimed, and I looked back at Ben. He needed help. I had to quit messing around. What do I do? What do I do? I was asking myself. What would Carl do? And I remembered those guys at the fire station talking about the ABCs. The first thing you did in an emergency was ABCs. A was airways. I looked at Ben's nose, clear as far as I could tell. Quickly, but gently, I knew you had to handle cold people carefully because of their hearts. Their hearts can kind of go nuts and not beat right. I rolled him onto his left side. Some water trickled out of his mouth. Good, I said out loud. Good, good, Ben. B was what? B was breathing. Was Ben breathing? I pulled the choke out to flood the motor and shut it off so I could hear better. But I couldn't hear anything. I put a finger under his nose and I didn't feel anything. Was it because my fingers were numb with cold? I stared at his chest, but I couldn't see it moving. Quickly, I felt with 2 fingers against his throat for that artery, the big one there up under your jaw, but I couldn't feel anything. No, I decided, Ben wasn't breathing. Quickly now, I knew I had to. I rolled Ben back onto his back, and then I bent over, pinched his nose shut, covered his small mouth with mine, and I gave him 2 small breaths. His lips were so cold they didn't even feel real. I checked again. He still wasn't breathing. C. I remembered that C was for circulation. Ben needed his blood to be moving around too. Oh God, I moaned, thinking, I've got to do it. I've got to do CPR. I had been taught how. Dad and I took a class at the community center. We practiced on a dummy, and I watched Carl do it more than once, but would I remember? I tilted Ben's head back a little, pinched his nose again, and started by giving him 1 breath. And then I sat up, put the heel of my right hand on his chest, covered it with my left, and I pressed down. 5 times I pressed down, 5 compressions, and then I bent over for another breath, and then 5 compressions, and then another breath, and then 5 compressions. I did not think about anything else as I did this. All I was doing was counting and pushing and breathing and praying inside that Ben would start breathing. Come on, Ben, I begged him. 5 compressions, and then another breath. Breathe, Ben, breathe. Ben needed to get to that ambulance fast. I had to get him down to the marina at Rock Hall. It wasn't that far, but I wasn't going to get there sitting here on the creek. 5 compressions, another breath. I paused long enough to start the motor again and put the boat into gear. 5 compressions, 1 breath. And then I headed my skiff in the right direction, grabbed the stern line, and looped it around the outboard's handle. Back to Ben. 5 compressions, 1 breath. Quickly I reached for the stern line and I wrapped it around a cleat to keep the motor straight. 5 compressions, another breath. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, it started to rain hard too. I ignored it. I ignored the rain, the cold, everything, and I just continued. 5 compressions, another breath, a quick check to make sure the boat was headed in the right direction. I glanced up and down, but there was no one else in the river. No one. I headed the boat downstream to Rock Hall, and I kept working on Ben. 5 compressions, 1 breath. All the way down the river, with the rain lashing my face and blurring my eyes until I saw a whirring ambulance light at the landing in the distance. I kept on with the CPR. I knew I couldn't stop. Maybe I should have. I could have slammed the boat into high gear and opened up the throttle, but I also knew that Ben needed me to keep breathing into him. 5 compressions, 1 breath. We were almost at the landing. I heard somebody yell my name, and Tilly started barking. And then more people were hollering, and there was a bank of flashing lights, at least 2 police cars, an ambulance. It was all a welcome blur. I continued with 5 compressions, 1 breath. Suddenly, Jimmy Landers, one of Carl's co-workers, was hollering really loud. "Keep it up, Brady, keep it up! That's it, pull the boat in, we've got you, don't stop, Brady!" And then things happened even faster after that. Jimmy was down beside me, taking over, and then lifting Ben up onto the dock, where Carl took him and continued the CPR. And then Jimmy jumped back up on the dock too, and I saw Carl place his fingers on Ben's neck, checking for a pulse. Someone else pulled in the boat while Carl and Jimmy kept working on Ben, even as they carried him to the ambulance. And before a policeman closed the back doors of the ambulance, Carl shouted, "We've got a pulse!" There wasn't time for him to say anything more. The doors were closed, and the ambulance took off, siren wailing, lights flashing. Completely out of breath, I stood there on the landing. I don't even have a clue how I got there, and I watched the lights disappear. I thought about how we were all going to be on that rescue show. We were all going to be on Rescue 911, I thought, all of us. I'll bet Tilly, too. A policeman at that point came over and put his arm around my shoulders and said, "Good job, son." He led me over to his cruiser and gave me a jacket. "Go ahead, get inside, get warmed up." "My dog," I mumbled. I was so out of breath I felt dizzy. I can't leave my dog in the boat. The policeman called for somebody to get Tilly, and both of us, Tilly and I, got in the back seat of the cruiser to warm up. They're taking him over to Lester Krebs Field, where they've got a medevac helicopter waiting. The policeman told me. He pulled out a notebook. "When you're ready, I need you to give us a little report." And I told him how I found Ben. And when the officer was satisfied, he offered me a ride home in the cruiser. But I wanted to get my boat back too. I assured him I could get home on my own. "I don't doubt it," he said, grinning. The rain had let up some, so the policeman let us go. He said he would call both my parents to let them know that I was okay and that I was headed home. Back in the boat, I put Ben's life jacket and his soaked parka to one side, and I picked up my Orioles hat from the floor where I had done CPR on Ben. It must have fallen off when they picked him up. It felt a little strange putting that hat back on my head after what it had just been through, but my head was cold and I needed to get started. Everybody else had left the landing by then. It was over. I began to feel a little relieved. Tilly and I headed upriver just as it started to rain hard again, but Carl's voice, "We've got a pulse," echoed in my ears, and I smiled. I think I could have driven through a blizzard right then. I felt both drained and elated. And I'll tell you this, I'm not the type of person who prays very much, hardly at all really. But about a minute later, I stopped the boat right in the middle of the Corsica River in the pouring rain to fold my hands. I just sat there with the engine in neutral, resting my head against the fingers of my tightly folded hands, because it had just hit me what happened. I'm not saying I cried, mind you, but I did have tears in my eyes. I thought about how it all happened, about fate. I mean, what if Dad hadn't been working in the shop that Monday? Normally, he'd be out on the water. If he had been, he wouldn't have come to get me out of school. There wouldn't have been the extra person to check the little creeks and the coves the way that I did. And I knew that I would never be the same person anymore, because that day on the Corsica River, the day I lifted Ben off the piling, I had straddled the invisible line between life and death that runs down all our lives every second with every breath we take. And thanks to some good luck and timing, and thanks to Tilly and God too, I had pulled Benjamin D'Angelo from one side to the other. And that is the end of chapter 5. So Ben was found. And they had a pulse, and they put him in that ambulance, and they took him off to the hospital. So we'll have to see what happens as we head into chapter 6 with Brady and his friends.